from the pantry because they know that I think ordering food to be delivered when there's plenty of food at home is a waste of money. But when I returned home a few hours later, I asked them what they'd been up to, and they said that they'd been playing video games and that they had fixed themselves some macaroni and cheese to have for dinner. And when I went into the kitchen to get myself a glass of water before bed, I saw no evidence that they had cooked anything. And if you know teenagers, there's always evidence. So I asked them if they were telling me the truth about what they had had for dinner, and because they were busted, they confessed that they had just had snacks. So at this point, I was kind of frustrated, both because they had not had anything nutritious for dinner, and also, which was more of an issue, was that they had lied to me. "Why did you lie?" I said. They said, "Well, we knew that you would be mad at us for not eating dinner, and so we lied." We all just went to bed, and I thought that I would just let it go. You know, pick your battles. But the next morning, I was up and I was out walking the dogs, and I found a paper bag from Chipotle in the yard. And when I picked it up, there was a delivery receipt on it saying that it was for Evan. So now I was really mad. Not because they had lied to me twice and they had tried to cover up the evidence of their lie by throwing their trash in the yard. Again, teenagers, they're brilliant. So I went and woke Evan up and I told him that he had to go to church with me. Children who lie have to go to church, I said. Now my husband thoughtfully expressed a little bit of concern that maybe making church a punishment was perhaps not the best parenting strategy. I said, it's not a punishment. It's a consequence. Because actions have consequences, right? This is something that we learn pretty quickly in life, especially if the consequences are immediate and direct results of our actions. If you cheat on a test, you could get a failing grade. If you fail to show up to work, you're probably going to get fired. If you run a red light in DC, you will definitely get a ticket in the mail. And if you lie to your mom, you could be roused from bed early on a Sunday morning and made to go to church. Other times, though, consequences are more indirect. They sometimes unfold over time. If we're untruthful enough times with people, they will stop trusting what we have to say. If we eat poorly and don't exercise, our health will suffer. If we break someone's trust repeatedly, eventually the other person may decide they no longer want to be in a relationship with us. Sometimes consequences are punishments. But the purpose of accepting consequences is not merely to be punitive. It's so that we can learn from our mistakes and help make things right to the person who's been harmed. As we, in this Lenten season, move through Maimonides' ancient steps of repentance, which are rooted in the Jewish tradition, we may have noticed that Maimonides calls those who are the perpetrators of harm to do a significant amount of work on themselves, even before they engage in any kind of relationship with the person or persons they have hurt. The first step in this process is to name and acknowledge the harm that we have caused. The second is for the perpetrator of that harm to start to make a change in their behavior. The third step is to accept the consequences and to do restitution for the harm that has been caused. All of this work comes before we even attempt to apologize for what we have done. Because the idea is that for an apology to mean something, we have to fully understand what it is that we are trying to make right. That we are willing to publicly acknowledge and accept responsibility for our actions. Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, who wrote the book on repentance and repair, who you may be interested to know is a really powerful Jewish voice right now for peace and justice in Israel and Gaza, somebody that you might want to be listening to. She writes, "A person who caused harm, even unwittingly, even with the best of intentions, will be better positioned to truly make amends after they have gone off to do some of the work, to own what they have done and become different." And she advocates using Maimonides' steps in a victim-centered approach to reconciliation that asks the question, what do victims need? And are they getting those things? She wrote this book because we live in a culture where accepting consequences for our actions and apologizing and making things right is just not the norm. Our society, by and large, encourages us to try to get away with as much as we can without getting caught. And even when bad behavior is found out, we often see people try to deflect or blame others or offer excuses or apologize as quickly as possible in a way that takes the least amount of responsibility. This week I was looking online for apology cards for one of our prayer stations for Second Sunday celebration next week. And many of these cards stood out to me as, well, not all that apologetic. They said things like, "I'm sorry for what I said when I had low blood sugar." "Oops, I didn't mean that." "Sorry I acted crazy. It will happen again." There was even one with a drawing of a person making air quotes that said, "I'm sorry." I don't even know what the point of sending a card like that would be, except to acknowledge that the other person has some feelings about something that you did, and you don't really accept responsibility or want to make things right. A person who sends that card just wants to be let off the hook, I think. Wants the person who has been harmed to just forgive and forget and get over it. And I think if we're really honest, there are times when we want that. Because accepting consequences is hard. Making things right when we have done harm and we have hurt somebody, it requires work on our part. It requires vulnerability and honesty with ourselves and with others. It means we have to look in the mirror and see how we have missed the mark and take responsibility for that. The story of King David's adultery from the book of 2 Samuel shows us how important consequences are in the process of repentance and repair. Now, I think that many of us are probably familiar with the story of David and Bathsheba, but just to refresh our memories, previously on Days of Our Judean Lives, in chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, we learn that while the Israelite army is at war with the Ammonites, David is safely taking harbor in Jerusalem. And one day while he is out taking a walk on the roof of his palace, he looks and sees a beautiful woman bathing. He asks one of his servants who she is and learns that her name is Bathsheba and that she's married to one of David's own soldiers, Uriah. But David summons her to his chambers. He sleeps with her and then sends her home. Sometime later, Bathsheba sends word to David that she is pregnant with his child. And in an attempt to cover up the mess that he has made, the king summons Uriah home from the war. But Uriah, a man of honor, refuses to go home to sleep with his wife while fellow soldiers and the ark of God are out sleeping in tents on the battlefield. So David invites Uriah to dinner and gets him drunk, but still he refuses to go home to his wife. And so because David's initial scheme to cover up his infidelity doesn't work, he sends instructions to the commanders of his army to put Uriah on the front line of the battle and to make sure that he is killed. When he dies, his wife Bathsheba mourns for him. And when her time of mourning is over, David takes her as his wife. Now the king thinks this matter is settled. He's not going to be found out for the sins he has committed. He has used his power for selfish purposes to take whatever he wanted, and he believes he is above accountability. But then in the part of the story that Ale read for us, God sends the prophet Nathan to confront the king. And Nathan does so by telling him a parable about a rich man and a poor man. The rich man has more than enough. But instead of taking one of his own animals from his numerous herds to provide hospitality for a hungry stranger, he takes the beloved lamb of his poor neighbor. David is rightly outraged by this injustice until the prophet reveals the true message of his parable. "You are the man," he says to the king. "This is what you have done by having Uriah killed and taking his wife as your own." When David is confronted with the truth and realizes he has not gotten away with anything, when faced with the deep harm he has done to Uriah and Bathsheba and to God, David confesses and owns his sin. But as we know, in the process of repentance and repair, naming and owning sin is just the first step. And God, through the prophet Nathan, isn't done. There will be consequences for David and for those he loves. The child David has conceived with Bathsheba will die, and calamity will be brought on his house and his lineage. His confession alone, his owning of his harm, even the pardon that God offers him is not sufficient to repair what he has done to other people. Now, we might wonder why the consequences that David will face for his actions are not his alone. Why would God allow more suffering for Bathsheba and to her innocent child? What have they done to deserve this? But you know, that's the way the consequences work sometimes, and why they are not always the same as punishment. While a punishment may fit the crime, consequences spill out and over. They hurt other people. There is collateral damage for our actions. And for that, David must also bear responsibility. A few weeks ago, I went to a training with the Dialogue for Peaceful Change, a process of conflict resolution that grew out of the Cornwell community in Northern Ireland. And one of the ways that they explained conflict is with the metaphor of an iceberg. When a conflict happens between two parties, there is a direct confrontation that begins to form the iceberg. But even after the two parties are not actively engaged in conflict, even after they have withdrawn from themselves, there is still a hardening and a freezing of that hurt until the point at which the two parties decide to engage in a process of working towards repair or a thawing of that iceberg. But even if the two parties begin to come together and work through their conflict, even if they can come to a place of reconciliation, there is still a whole community of people who have been indirectly involved in the conflict. And this is the part of the iceberg that lies deep beneath the surface. The families and friends who have listened to the complaints about the other person's actions, who took one side or the other, a community that has been divided and impacted and harmed by the experience of the conflict, they too have to be brought into the process of reconciliation. They have to be told about the peace agreement between the two conflicted parties, and they have to be invited to lay aside the pain that they have held on to so that everyone may move forward. This is part of what it means to take responsibility and to do the work required to make things right. As a consequence of his actions, David would have to bury his son and hold his wife through their shared grief. He would have to watch others suffer for his sin. And perhaps this is truly what helps him to be able to be transformed. So what about us? Well, I think it's important for us to recognize the wisdom of the biblical historian in including all of David's story in the history of Israel. He was one of, if not the greatest king of God's people, but the narrative does not shy away from the ugly and evil parts of his story. The Bible tells the whole truth about David, which means that we can tell the whole truth about our lives too. We can admit to the mistakes that we have made and the harm that we have done, the hurt that we have caused. We can engage in repentance and repair because God is not done with us yet. As Rabbi Rittenberg writes, the reason to do repentance work is not because you are bad until you do these things, but because we should care about each other, about taking care of each other and making sure that we are all okay. Taking seriously that I might have hurt you, even inadvertently, even because I wasn't at my best and my blood sugar was low. It is an act of love and care. It is an opportunity to open my heart wider than it has been, to let in more empathy, more curiosity about my choices and reactions and how they have impacted others. It moves us out of avoidance and blame and denial and into the reality of what we have done, so we can finally face it bravely and begin to learn and grow from that experience. And there is one more thing that I want to say about this story in relation to Maimonides' steps of repentance and repair, which is that I personally don't think that the consequences that are imposed by God on David really offer restitution to those who have been harmed, especially Bathsheba. In fact, throughout this story, she isn't even really seen as a person who could be harmed. She's simply referred to as an object. She's called the daughter of Elam, the wife of Uriah, the mother of David's son, as if her only value is through the men to whom she is related. She's viewed as something to be desired and possessed and used. She is abused and then made into a widow and then forced into a marriage with her abuser. And then her child dies. So I'm not sure if it's possible for things to be made right for Bathsheba, given all that she has suffered. But somewhere, someone along the way tried to give her back some of her agency and identity, and included her in the genealogy of Jesus, which begins the Gospel of Matthew. Now, even there, she is still not called by her own name. She is recorded in the genealogy only as the mother of Solomon and the wife of Uriah. But she is there nonetheless. Bathsheba, one of only 5 women recognized in the 42 generations between Abraham and Jesus. Her significance in the story of God's salvation has not been overlooked. Her pain is not forgotten in our scriptures. She is recorded as one of God's righteous. Rabbi Rittenberg writes that when amends cannot be made directly to the person who has been harmed, it is up to future generations to do the work. So we can offer some restitution to Bathsheba.